The Nebraska Cornhuskers began their fall camp this Monday, and it is my opinion that the biggest storylines to follow are on the offensive side of the football. Don't get me wrong, the defense has their own storylines to follow. Miles Farmer just left the program through the transfer portal after being suspended from the team. There are going to be likely two true freshmen that start in Tony White's 3-3-5, and they're going to be starting at the defensive line positions. And MJ Sherman, nearly a five-star prospect out of high school when Georgia recruited him, transferred from Georgia to Nebraska, and I think he could be the Huskers' best player on the defensive side of the football. However, much like I was saying this time last year in regards to Ohio State's defense, installing a new defensive scheme is going to take time, especially with it being a 3-3-5 and with the personnel that Nebraska has. And I was saying that to Ohio State fans last year, and Ohio State, with talent, with development, with recruiting, was in a much better position last year than Nebraska is this year. I think Tony White's defense in year one is likely going to struggle. And the offense, on the other hand, I think could have a phenomenal year, given the talent they have at the lines of scrimmage, and given the fact that there's going to be a transfer starting at quarterback, starting at center, and there's also going to be a transfer wide receiver in Killy Kemp, who's coming in from Virginia after having a huge 2021 year when Brennan Armstrong was very successful with Nouredin Nouili as his offensive coordinator, but along with Brennan Armstrong, Killy Kemp had a very down 2022 season. So the offense, despite new leadership, despite new players, a new quarterback especially, I think has the potential to perform at a high level. The defense deserves another video, and while I think there will be struggles in year one, I think Tony White long-term is going to be a great defensive coordinator, and this defense should make a great leap forward from year one to year two, which is going to be exciting because Nebraska will be playing a completely different schedule, moving from a Big Ten West schedule to the new Big Ten round-robin schedule, including USC and UCLA some years for the Nebraska Cornhuskers. But let's focus on this year and let's talk about the offense. Last year, the offense was outside of the top 100 in points per game. It was a very bad offense. It was terrible. Let me tell you some of the scores last year. Nebraska was held to 14 points by Rutgers. They were held to 14 points by Oklahoma. Oklahoma, mind you, after that game against Nebraska on the road, surrendered 41 points to Kansas State, led by former Nebraska quarterback Adrian Martinez. After that game, where they gave up 41 points to the Kansas State Wildcats, they gave up 55 to TCU, where Max Duggan had like 2 or 3 passes probably of longer than 50 yards and also had a 70-yard scramble for a touchdown. And Oklahoma also gave up 49 to Texas in a 49-0 loss, and they gave up 42 points to Kansas. Some other teams that held Nebraska's offense to disastrously low numbers were North Dakota, an FCS school. Holding any Big Ten school to 38 points is unacceptable. Northwestern holding Nebraska to only 28 points, when Northwestern would later go on to have a 1-11 record, and Pat Fitzgerald fired after a hazing scandal. Well, that's pretty humiliating. Illinois, they held Nebraska to 9 points. Michigan held Nebraska to 3. Wisconsin held Nebraska to 14, despite Wisconsin having one of their more mediocre or below average performances on defense when it comes to the expectations that Jim Leonhard set at his time in Madison as a defensive coordinator. Nebraska's offense couldn't move the football, especially on the ground, against even mediocre defenses. And the reason they scored 24 against Iowa late in the season was partially because of injuries to Iowa's secondary, but also the fact that Iowa offensively was just terrible. And whether it was Spencer Petras or later Alex Padilla, the team just would give Nebraska the ball. It would give Nebraska's offense chances and chances to make big plays. And that just goes to show that Casey Thompson and Trey Palmer, not to take the credit away from them, they're great playmakers. And Trey Palmer had 1,000 yards last season. And even I, who was very high on the Cornhuskers entering 2022, did not think that Trey Palmer would have that great of a season. But the Iowa game, that was the perfect moment to secure a win. Not only was Nebraska opportunistic, taking advantage of Iowa's injuries and mistakes, but they also showed the potential that Scott Frost, Mark Whipple, and Arik Gilbert wasted. Absolutely wasted. I thought that Casey Thompson, Trey Palmer, Marcus Washington, Anthony Grant, I thought that those 4 skill position players met or exceeded my expectations and predictions entering the 2022 season. But the problem, and this is where we're now going to start talking about the 2023 offense, the problem was the trench play was one of the worst in the Big Ten and one of the worst in the country. And the Big Ten fielded some pretty porous offensive lines in 2022, whether it was Indiana, Nebraska, who would be the lowest of the low along with Rutgers. Iowa's offensive line didn't perform at a high level. Neither did Wisconsin's. Michigan State's offensive line wasn't healthy. They didn't perform at a high level. Northwestern, they had Pete Skoronski, but outside of that, the offensive line was garbage. Outside of maybe Josh Preby, who I think will be a great player this year for Northwestern. But to get back to Nebraska, they just did not have a good 2022 season at all. According to the simple ranking system, they were the 77th best team in the country. They were 4-8. They barely scored over an average of 3 touchdowns per game. The defense was another big reason why they failed in 2022, but all around, Scott Frost just didn't know how to put together a good staff. He didn't know how to develop. He knew how to recruit, but he did not know how to develop and how to put his players in a position to succeed. And I think that's where Matt Rhule, Marcus Satterfield, and Tony White are different from Scott Frost and his staff. Matt Rhule has a proven track record of putting his players in a position to succeed both on the field and off the field in their daily lives. And Marcus Satterfield last year was a part of a South Carolina team that was one of the most improved teams from the beginning of the season to the end of the season. South Carolina in 2022, the Gamecocks, they started out the season struggling, absolutely struggling, and Spencer Rattler looks like one of the worst quarterbacks in the SEC. And the Gamecocks finished 8-5. According to the simple ranking system, they were the 31st best team in the country. They beat 2 top 10 opponents in back-to-back weeks, Tennessee and Clemson, where they scored 63 and 31 points respectively. South Carolina finished the season, despite having the 30th best strength of schedule. They had a top 40 scoring offense, scoring 32.2 points per game, and their defense regressed from 2021 to 2022, allowing nearly 4 to 5 more points per game. So bringing in a new quarterback is never easy, and South Carolina under both years of the Shane Beamer era so far, and especially this year where they lost Jordan Birch to Oregon and they also lost their running back. It's Marshawn Lloyd. I nearly forgot his name to South Carolina. There's been constant turnover at South Carolina since Shane Beamer came. Marcus Satterfield had experience there as well with that, and he made the offense work in a good way. So I have confidence in him as an offensive coordinator. The coaching staff all around with Nebraska, I think, is going to be good. I know that Donovan Raiola was retained as the offensive line coach, which I thought was somewhat strange. Maybe was an attempt to try and lure Dylan Raiola to commit to the Huskers, but also Donovan Raiola does have experience as an offensive line coach at the NFL level and the collegiate level, so there's also definitely an aspect to that where he was probably one of Scott Frost's better hires in the 2022 preseason. So this team, trench play, is probably the biggest question mark, much like last season, just because the trenches have been constructed so poorly over what now is closer to a decade than not under Mike Riley, under Scott Frost, probably under Bo Pelini too. It's almost tradition for Nebraska to have smaller and weaker offensive lines compared to opposing Big Ten defensive lines. And to me, that's probably the biggest storyline to follow is who starts at offensive line, does it improve, what happens? Because the skill position players I think are good. I think Nebraska probably, if you factor in running back, tight end, quarterback, and wide receiver, and you put all those players and factor them into one room, they're probably in the top half of the Big Ten there. I'd say they have better skill position players than Rutgers, Indiana, Northwestern. I'd say even better skill position players all around than, let's say Iowa, even though Iowa has really good tight ends and their wide receiver and quarterback and running back rooms all upgraded. They'd be around Iowa, probably higher than the Hawkeyes. Wisconsin, they'd be similar to the Badgers there as well. They definitely have better wide receivers, and in my opinion, they do have a better quarterback. Maryland, that's a team where I'd say is just barely ahead of the Huskers in overall skill position rankings. So the Huskers are middle of the road to above average in the Big Ten in that category. And also don't forget about Purdue as well. Purdue lost a lot at wide receiver and at quarterback as well, losing Aiden O'Connell and also losing Charlie Jones to the NFL draft after winning the Big Ten West in 2022. So the Huskers at skill position, they do have questions. There are storylines to follow, but there's much more security there than on the offensive line. Let's look at who's projected to start on the offensive line according to ourlads.com. Teddy Prohaska and Bryce Benhart are the projected starting tackles. At guard, you have Turner Corcoran, who last year made a move to the inside just because of his size, and then Nouredin Nouili, who was suspended last year due to PED use. He's back. He's projected to be a starter at left guard. Ben Scott, who's an incoming transfer from Arizona State, looks to start at center. Backing up Nouili, there's Ethan Piper at guard. Henry Lutovsky is also backing up Corcoran at right guard. This is again according to ourlads.com. Gunnar Gotula looks to be backing up Prohaska at left tackle as a true freshman nonetheless. And Jacob Hood, who transferred in from Georgia, looks to be backing up Bryce Benhart at right tackle. So there are young players in the two deep at offensive line, and the offensive line, I would say, isn't deep. And whether it's Corcoran, whether it's Benhart, whether it's Nouili coming off a one-year suspension where he hasn't been on the field against opposing teams in a whole season, this offensive line has tons of question marks surrounding it. Ben Scott, and whether it's Prohaska at tackle or Benhart on the other side of tackle, those three, one of them will contend for the best offensive lineman, which, kind of fulfills itself. But I think guard is probably the weakness of this offensive line. That's for sure. I think Corcoran, look, at a very good high school career, rated as a 4-star coming out of high school. But what Scott Frost did to him, I don't know if that can be repaired. It can be, but it's very unlikely. And then Nouili being suspended for a year for PED use and now coming back to the team. We'll see if he's back to 100%. In 2022, before he was suspended, it looked like he could have been the team's best offensive lineman, but we'll have to see how it plays out in the 2023 season, of course. But there are tons of questions there. I'd say Ben Scott playing at Arizona State and coming in, and he was rated as an average to above average center according to Pro Football Focus. I think that he'll be a good leader, good starting center. I think that he'll help rally the offensive line to at least improve compared to last season, but there are question marks surrounding this offensive line, obviously. Now, for some of the other positions, can the tight ends stay healthy, and how do the wide receivers perform? Well, at tight end, it sounds like Thomas Fidone is healthy. For now, though, Nate Borkacher is projected as the starting tight end over Fidone. But I think that both of these tight ends, Fidone hasn't played on the field much at all due to constant injury. I hope that his injury issues get resolved and he has a phenomenal season. I hate injuries personally. It's one of the banes of my existence as a college football fan. Even And I think this is how all college football fans should be. No one should ever cheer for injuries or celebrate even when an opposing team's player gets hurt. Injuries are terrible. They ruin careers. Jake Butt, I'm a Michigan fan, but Jake Butt got injured against Florida State, tearing his ACL in the Orange Bowl, and that prematurely ended his NFL career. And even if it's for Ohio State, Michigan State, Georgia, TCU, teams that either have humiliated Michigan or are chief rivals of Michigan, I want those players to stay as healthy as possible and perform at the highest level. So even if you're an Iowa fan and we're talking about Nebraska, we should hope that Fidone has a healthy season. We should hope that. But him and Borkacher are going to be fighting for that number 1 tight end spot. Backing them up is Arik Gilbert. Arik Gilbert, we'll see if he gets a waiver to play this fall. We'll see how that goes. But I have to see it in order to believe it in regards to him playing on the field. I really do. I look at this team, and they're deep at tight end if Gilbert can get on the field, if he resolves his off-the-field issues, and if Fidone can stay healthy, this can quickly be one of the Big Ten's best tight end rooms. There's a very high ceiling to this tight end room, but also a low floor due to Gilbert's off-the-field issues and Fidone's injury history. Borkacher's obviously the most experienced within Nebraska, but he definitely has the lowest ceiling. So, tight end, I think that within the first few weeks, we'll figure out how good the tight end room is, but it will take a little longer to figure that out compared to other rooms. Wide receiver, I'm telling you right now, I'm very high in regards to wide receiver. I think there's a good chance they reload overall. I don't think they have a Trey Palmer player on their roster, but Marcus Washington last season, Washington had 471 receiving yards and 1 receiving touchdown. That 1 receiving touchdown came against Iowa. Billy Kemp, who will also be starting at wide receiver, Billy Kemp IV, had 116 receiving yards last year on 16 receptions with Virginia. But that Virginia team was an awful football team. Largely regressed from the 2021 team in Bronco Mendenhall's final year with the program. And in that year, Billy Kemp IV had 74 receptions for 725 receiving yards and 6 receiving touchdowns. He's 5'9", 180 pounds. And then finally we have Zavier Betts. Zavier Betts is 6'2", about 200 pounds, and he was out for the 2022 season, suspended from the team, but he's returned to the team. And then backing up Washington, Betts, and Kemp, we have Malachi Coleman, a true freshman, Isaiah Garcia-Casteneda, who had a fire start, I guess that's the best word I could use, to the 2022 season before entering the transfer portal, deciding to return to Nebraska, and then Joshua Fleeks, who reportedly showed up to fall camp overweight and hasn't started practicing yet, but he looks to be also in that 2-deep rotation as well, provided he cuts weight and begins practice sooner rather than later. So wide receiver, I think, is very deep. I think that IGC, Zavier Betts, Billy Kemp IV, and Marcus Washington are all going to get plenty of playing time. I wouldn't be surprised if Malachi Coleman gets enough playing time to where he can't redshirt entering next year. Very talented player. There was a reason that Mickey Joseph was targeting him and maintaining a great relationship with him. He's a really phenomenal athlete. And then finally, for running back, how does that room shake out? Because Anthony Grant could start. Ramir Johnson, despite being a lighter back, he did start for a lot of 2021 due to injuries, and he was good. Gabe Ervin Jr., he could also start as well. He's projected to be the starter, actually, according to ourlads.com. A.J. Allen, he transferred out, left to Miami, where he's guaranteed to get more playing time, or at least less competition. Anthony Grant is definitely the most proven running back. He had 915 rushing yards last year on 218 carries, averaging 4.2 yards per carry and also having 6 rushing touchdowns. Gabe Ervin Jr. only on 20 carries had 94 yards, averaging 4.7 yards per carry, and he did not have a single rushing touchdown. Ramir Johnson had 19 carries for 85 yards and averaged 4.5 yards per carry. but he got 12 of those carries against Iowa, where he had 52 yards and he averaged 4.3 yards per carry with a fumble. Rahmir Johnson stands at 5'10", 185 pounds, and Gabe Ervin Jr. and Anthony Grant are both heavier, bigger, more true running backs. Anthony Grant's 5'11", 200 pounds. Gabe Ervin Jr. is 6 foot, 215 pounds. Ervin being the more Big Ten power back. Anthony Grant, he's not a Kenneth Walker, but I do see similarities in their shiftiness and also vision, and I pointed that out in the 2022 season. He's like, I'd say, he's Kenneth Walker. I don't know how to exactly make this comparison because they're not equal players, but he has some of those attributes where he has speed, he has good vision, he can juke. He's not big, he's not exactly powerful, but he's not small either, like let's say Rahmir Johnson is. So how does that running back room shake out? Who's running back number one? Grant nearly had 1,000 yards last year. So what are some of my predictions for this team and for this offense? Well, at running back, regardless of who starts, I don't think there is a 1,000-yard running back this year. I do think there will be a 2, possibly 3-man rotation. I think that each of the backs, Ervin, Grant, and Johnson, all have their different abilities. They all complement each other well. I would say that Anthony Grant, in my opinion, just with Gabe Ervin Jr.'s history of there's a lot of hype around him. He is a good player, but at the end of the day, someone starts over him or an injury occurs. It's probably the safer bet to say Anthony Grant's going to start, but Gabe Ervin Jr. does have the higher upside, and with his size and more Big Ten play style, if he can stay healthy, it might be better for the team to start him, especially if the offensive line can't get a good push, and you need a guy who can, carry the team forward for 1 or 2 yards before falling over. That extra 1 to 2 yards, what Big Ten power backs like, let's say, Hassan Haskins like to do in 2021. It's very important to have a reliable running back who can get yards after contact, and Gabe Ervin Jr. is that kind of running back. But I don't think any will get over 1,000 rushing yards. Even though I think this team will go bowling, which means they'll play in an extra game. Extra games mean more impressive statistics, more total yards, more total points, more total touchdowns. Still, I don't think there will be a 1,000-yard running back. However, Nebraska will have multiple 500 or more yard rushers. I think Jeff Sims will be one of those. I think Anthony Grant will be one of those. Between Gabe Ervin Jr. and Rahmir Johnson, there will likely be one more, but potentially there could be a fourth as well if the running back rotation is a 2 to 3 man system and the offensive line's competent and Nebraska likes to run the football and Jeff Sims is healthy and isn't hit hard enough in too many games. There could be multiple 500-yard rushers on this team. I think that happens personally because I think there's too much talent in the running back room, and Jeff Sims is an athletic, true dual-threat quarterback. The likes that I even think are better and more athletic than that of Adrian Martinez. I think Jeff Sims is more athletic than even Adrian Martinez was at Nebraska. Thomas Fidone will be the Huskers' starting tight end. Marcus Washington will be the team's best wide receiver, with Billy Kemp being the team's second best wide receiver. Zavier Betts will have something to say about that. He's a very athletic player from the state of Nebraska, diamond in the rough type of player where he was a 3-star out of high school. Very explosive, but I think that it will take time after a year off of football for him to get back in the rhythm of things. The offensive line will remain a thorn in this team's side, and it will be a big weakness, especially at guard. I have a lot more faith in the tackles than I do in the guards. The tackle unit could be a below average to above average Big Ten unit at best, which would be great, but I don't have any hope for guard. Center with Ben Scott could also be at an average Power 5 or Big Ten level, but guard with Turner Corcoran, I think is just, there's too many holes and questions at guard because Corcoran hasn't had a good game or good year in his tenure at Nebraska, and Nouili's coming off of a 1-year suspension, so there are just too many questions there for my own comfort. Some strengths of this team, I think athleticism and depth at quarterback, because if Jeff Sims goes down, or for whatever reason, maybe they have different packages for another quarterback, though I doubt that, Heinrich Haarberg and Chubba Purdy are still with the team, both of whom can run the football. Heinrich Haarberg, high-ceiling player, great build, and Chubba Purdy was recruited by Mark Whipple out of high school, went to Florida State where he suffered some injuries, and then he transferred to Nebraska. So he's had Power 5 experience at multiple different schools. This quarterback room is deep. There's athleticism not just with Jeff Sims, but also with Haarberg and Purdy as well. The outside rushing attack, because the tackles will be better than the guards, because Jeff Sims and his athleticism, he'll be able to scramble on the outside, and Nebraska has quick running backs, but also powerful running backs. I think the run attack will be a strength, or at least, just an average factor of the team, but on the outside it will certainly be a strength. And finally, great wide receivers. This team will have wide receivers that can contend for all Big Ten status, and Marcus Washington, Billy Kemp, and if Zavier Betts quickly reacclimates to the program, he will be able to achieve that kind of status as well. Weaknesses, of course, that revolves around the offensive line. I think tight end depth is going to be a weakness. I know that I said it could be a strength, but that all depends on whether Arik Gilbert plays or not. And I don't think he'll play. I have to see him play in order to believe that he will play. No kind of preseason talk or potentially even insider information could convince me, because we heard that about him with Georgia and even him with Florida, and it never worked. He could not get past the off-field issues, and maybe I'm doubting too much, but at this point I have to see it to believe it. And with just Borkacher and Fidone, with a talent like Arik Gilbert, just taking that one player and making him off limits for on-field performance or a non-factor, that makes the tight end room from a strength to a weakness almost immediately with the kind of player that Arik Gilbert is. Freak athlete out of high school. He was up there with Darnell Washington, who just went into the draft after playing at Georgia. 5-star, had a phenomenal true freshman season at LSU, and he's just faded away from the game ever since then. I think Fidone will be a great tight end if he can stay healthy, but you have to wonder if he can stay healthy for the whole season. And Borkacher, as we mentioned earlier, is steady, but doesn't exactly have a high ceiling. And finally, there is an unproven element to this passing attack. It's not from the wide receivers, it's from Jeff Sims. Jeff Sims last season had a quarterback efficiency rating that was outside of the top 100, a 44 QBR. He only had 1,115 passing yards, and he only averaged 5.9 yards per pass attempt, 5 touchdowns to 3 interceptions, and he had 19 sacks. Now, I know overall that at Georgia Tech with Jeff Collins, they had an even worse supporting cast than Adrian Martinez or Casey Thompson ever endured at Nebraska. I mean, Georgia Tech under Jeff Collins was horrible, and even worse than horrible year after year. And then when Brent Key took over as the interim head coach, they began to play at a serviceable level, which just proved that Jeff Collins was the problem, not necessarily Georgia Tech. But, rest my case, Jeff Sims is, regardless of his supporting cast, when you have those kind of statistics, and his best game, I think, was at the beginning of the year against Clemson, where he had above a 100 passer rating, and Clemson and Georgia Tech with Collins at that point basically had him in an impossible situation, and he still had a touchdown pass, nearly 50 rushing yards, but he had a bad game against not West Virginia, but a bad game against Virginia. His team got shut out by Ole Miss. Another bad game against an FCS school. He does have an unproven element to his passing attack, but he is proven as a dual threat quarterback, running for over 300 yards in all 3 of his seasons where he's played for the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets, along with at minimum 1 rushing touchdown. So this offense, low floor, but I think an even higher ceiling, potentially a limitless ceiling if the offensive line can do the unthinkable and perform at a Big Ten level this year. Thank you guys for watching. If you liked this video, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, comment your thoughts on Nebraska's offense down below. Tell me how many points per game you think they're going to score this year, as the Huskers were outside of the top 100 last year in that category, and I think there's a very good chance they're going to be inside of the top 30 potentially this year in points per game on offense. Hit the like button, hit the notification bell, and I'll see you guys later. Bye-bye.